Hi, and welcome to another video on object-oriented programming in C#. With me, Marinas Toman. Okay, so in this video we'll look at constructors in C#. So a constructor is a special method that is used to initialize objects. The advantage of this is what is called, a constructor is called when an object of class is created. So it's called by default. So it can be used to set initial values for fields. So you could see, in our previous example, this is what we had. So we had our property and our field, and then we created an object of our class person, and then we had to set the field through the property, and then we could access the property again, or we could access the field through the property. But let's say we wanted to initialize when we first create an object of a class, we wanted to initialize the field with some value. So this is what we would do. So by default, the default constructor will just be the name of the class, and it will have no parameters. So if you create this default constructor, what you're doing is you're overwriting the one that's already provided for you. So it's always good, practice to provide your own default constructor instead of just using the default one that's provided. So in this example, we're just setting, the initial value of the field model with some string, and then whenever we create an object of this class car, and we do this, we can just get the initial value, which is Mustang. Okay, so constructors, as it says in the name, it's called whenever you're constructing an object of a class, and by default just the default constructor will be called. So you can see here, this is when you say new car, what you're really doing is you're calling the constructor of the class, and you're saying give me some new memory enough to store a new object of car, and call it or of type car, call it forward, give me some new memory, and call this method as well. So basically what will happen is you will get the new piece of memory that will have this constructor, this method, and this field. Okay, so that's basically how you call the constructor. You have to call it with the new keyword, because you're basically allocating a new piece of memory and you're using the constructor, so you're calling creating a new object of type car. So there's a couple of things that are required when we're creating a constructor. So the constructor name has to match the class name. So as you can see here, the class is called car. The constructor has to be the exact name of the class as well. It cannot have a return type, so that's why it's a specialized method. So it's a method that actually doesn't have a return type, so it's like one of a kind, and it's called whenever you have to call it basically to create an object. So this is how we create an object. We actually create an object just by calling the constructor. All classes have constructors by default, so if you do not create a class constructor yourself, C# creates one for you. And basically what it'll do is it just sets up these fields with some piece of memory. It just gives you enough memory so that it'll set that string basically to null or an empty string. So the thing is that if it creates, if you let C# if you just use their normal default, you can't set your own initial values with that. So what we're doing in this example is we're just implementing our own default constructor. So constructors save time basically, because we can set initial values, but you'll see as well that so that's the default constructor. That's the first kind of one we got to look at. It's the one every object gets by default, even if you don't provide anything. So if this code wasn't here, we would get one by default that would just allocate some memory to the fields. Okay, so what we really care about though is constructors that can take parameters. Okay, because really what we want to do is, in this example they're using public, but we want to have a private field and we want to have a property, and then we want the user to be able to pass in their own variables, so their own instance of an object. So if it was a class car and we had a string in there called model, whenever the user of our class created an object of this, well, what we want is for them to be able to pass in their own data when they're creating it. So basically their own initial value. So you can see, type car called Ford, and then we again new keyword, and then we just pass in our initial value. So what this is doing is calling this constructor here. There's no return type, because basically what this is returning is a new piece of memory, or new reference to memory, where all of this stuff is stored in memory. So you can have as many parameters as you want, and the thing about constructors is that they're overloaded. Of course they have to be, because they're all going to be the same name. So you could have multiple constructors in here, but as you know, the same rules apply for overloading methods. You have to have different either different types going in here, or a different number of variables as well. So for example, you could have just a public car string model name and then close brackets, and it might set the model name to whatever's passed in, and then just set the color to red and the year to this year maybe, or the year 2000 or something like that. So what you could do is you could have multiple different constructors then, and then you can give the user multiple options for different ways to build an object of your class. But anyway, in this example, we're just showing that we could have 3 fields here, and we could pass in 3 initial variables. So if we created it, then we pass in 2 strings and an integer, and that's basically calling this class constructor, creating a new object and calling it Ford. So so one of the things, so this is this example opened, one of the things about one of the kind of conventions that you'll see whenever you're going through the Microsoft kind of documentation and their examples, they will normally have these, so it'll be private anyway, the fields will be private, but they will start with an underscore. And then when it comes to this, they'll basically just have the same, it'll be the same variable name but without the underscore. So it just kind of stops any confusion, or you having to think up new names or anything, different variable names. And yeah, you'll probably see that it's in the Ulster coding guide anyway, something like this, just to keep things a little more simple and more descriptive as well. So we could do that, of course, these. But the main thing is that we can initialize, and this is normally the kind of constructor that you're going to want to use. You're going to want to give the user the ability to set their own values whenever they're creating an object for the first time. Okay. Yeah. So this is just, you know, a bit kind of, it's, if you go over to Microsoft, you'll just see, you know, whenever they're, when they've got their fields, they start with some underscore, and then just, you know, so they don't have to worry about having different variable names. Keeps things a lot clearer. So constructors, what we really care about is the default constructor. So we normally want to give, you know, give some kind of initial value. So let's say, you know, for example, that it was a car class and there was a variable in here, registration. You know, every car might be initialized with a certain, you know, a unique registration number. You know, so that might be a good thing to include in your default constructor. And then we also want to give the users the ability to pass in their own, you know, arguments at whenever they're initializing these objects. And then we can also overload the constructor, so we can have many different constructors, you know, as long as we abide by the overloading rules. So yeah, as they say here, just like other methods, constructors can be overloading by using different numbers of parameters or different types of parameters. Because remember, overloading doesn't really take account of the return type anyway, so when it's looking at methods, it's all about these input parameters. Okay, that's everything for constructors. As you can see here, there's kind of, you know, it just shows you that, so this is the way that it would normally, you know, we had to do it before. We would use the default constructor, and this is just the free one that C# would give us. So this would basically just give us memory for our fields inside the class, and then we would have to set the fields ourselves with what our initial values were, you know, so that's like 4 lines of code, and we'd have to do that for every object. Our new way is that we can provide the user with, you know, basically in our constructor we can say, you know, you can pass in initial values when you're creating this. So these, you know, 4 lines of code are the same as these 10 lines of code over here. So you can see it reduces the amount of code that the client has to use, the client code, and it also it's good practice, you know, for our classes to become more robust and usable as well. So just another thing to note on constructors in C#12, so beginning after that, you can define your primary constructor as part of the class declaration. So you can see here that if you wanted to, you could actually take in the parameter in your class declaration here, and then, you know, you can set your private field to whatever was passed in. So this is another way of basically, as they say, a primary constructor. This will be like your default. So that's, you know, another way that you can do it in if you're using C#12 or later. Okay, so that's everything for the video. Thanks for watching.